Greetings, seekers of the profound and arcane tales of the far future. I am the Lore Master, and today we journey through a turbulent and regrettable chapter in the annals of the Adeptus Astartes, turning our gaze upon the saga of the Space Wolves. We shall recount the era that has come to be known in whispered tones as the Months of Shame. Join me as we unfold the pages of this somber narrative. The Months of Shame stands as an informal term, denoting a clandestine and ignominious period in the annals of the Imperium. It alludes to the series of purgations executed by the Inquisition in the aftermath of the initial Armageddon conflict in the year 444 M41. The term also encapsulates the extended period of strife between the Inquisition's Armageddon quarantine cadre and the Space Wolves, a storied contingent of the Space Marine Brotherhood. This rift brought them to the brink of an internecine conflict that could have escalated into a civil war within the Imperium. The Space Wolves and the Inquisition found themselves in fierce contention, with tensions running high until the advent of 451, M41, when an unsteady ceasefire was brokered. Notwithstanding the cessation of direct conflict, the larger dispute between the Inquisition and the Space Wolves chapter lingered, fraught with unresolved tensions. The Space Wolves, a chapter of the Adeptus Astartes, stand out within the Imperium for their distinctive and rebellious nature, both in their tactical framework and ideological ethos. They often operate in ways that diverge from established military protocols and the edicts of the Imperium, underlining their staunch independence. The unique customs and practices of the Space Wolves have at times ignited disputes with the authorities of the Imperium, leading to their actions being perceived as uncooperative, insubordinate, or in extreme cases, bordering on heresy. The harrowing span of history referred to as the Months of Shame was far from the first instance of the Space Wolves engaging in conflict with other branches of the Imperium's vast bureaucracy. Their past is peppered with altercations, particularly with the Adeptus Ministorum and the Inquisition, among others. Logan Grimnar, known as the Great Wolf, and serving as the chapter master of the Space Wolves, had direct experience with such confrontations. These encounters had made him acutely conscious of the secretive Grey Knights chapter's existence, subsequently fostering in him a deep-seated wariness and scorn for the Inquisition and its often clandestine operations. The initial conflict on Armageddon, occurring in 444 M41, was a pivotal war for the Imperium that was led and ultimately won under the strategic leadership of the Space Wolves, particularly guided by their chapter master, the Great Wolf Logan Grimnar. The Inquisition, in tandem with a detachment of Grey Knights, was compelled to intervene upon the realization that they faced an insidious foe. Multitudes of Chaos cultists known as the Children of Sanguinary Unholiness, accompanied by a formidable, cornate contingent of Chaos Space Marines from the World Eater's Traitor Legion, commanded by the demon Primarch Angron and his elite retinue, the 12 cornate demons of the Cruor Praetoria. Grimnar, privy to the existence of the Grey Knights, sought their martial prowess to counter the demonic onslaught. An impromptu assembly of the Grey Knights, fortified by various Inquisition elements and a cadre of up to 30 Inquisitors, embarked post-haste to Armageddon to partake in the fray that concluded in their favor. The contingent was under the aegis of Lord Inquisitor Gesme Kisnaros, a shadowy figure not pledged to any of the Inquisition's established orders. The presence of the Inquisition on Armageddon was twofold: to vanquish the Chaos threat and to ensure the secrecy of critical intelligence concerning the great enemy's nature, and the clandestine Imperial forces arrayed against it, especially the Grey Knights, remained confined to Armageddon. This secrecy aimed to prevent the spread of such knowledge throughout the galaxy, mitigating the risk of chaos taint among humanity's billions. This aspect of concealment is integral to the Inquisition's broader remit, to safeguard the Imperium against the perennial menace of chaos. This mandate often necessitates severe and widespread purges, where Imperial citizens can face execution based on suspicion alone. and entire planets may endure the nightmare of exterminatus procedures. Signs of impending conflict with the Inquisition's post-conflict directives surfaced months before the war's conclusion during the initial encounter between Logan Grimnar and the inquisitorial reinforcements. Grimnar, well aware of the Inquisition's intent to obscure the war's realities, openly opposed the typical suppressive actions to follow. Given the Space Wolves' record of challenging Imperial mandates and their previous confrontations with the Imperium, Grimnar's stance could be misconstrued as either naive or a provocation for further conflict, with his approach to the Inquisitors bordering on disdain. Nonetheless, Grimnar's resistance stemmed from a genuine concern for Armageddon's civilians and defenders, questioning the morality of rescuing a world only to subject its saviors and survivors to the Inquisition's punitive measures for their knowledge of chaos or the covert Imperial forces combating it. He had deliberately designed the defense of Armageddon and the deployment of the Grey Knights to reduce the likelihood of the citizenry learning the horrific truths of the conflict, fully aware this meant severe losses among the defenders, space marines and mortals alike. The Inquisition, however, remained unyielding, upholding its authority as the Emperor's will incarnate, tasked with the imperative of concealing the existence of chaos. From their perspective, the sacrifice of millions was a grim necessity to prevent the potential need to purge billions, recalling the dark days following the Horus heresy. Containing the threat and knowledge on Armageddon was seen as a logical choice, sparing the wider Imperium from the greater catastrophe of chaotic dissemination. The Armageddon containment strategy was adopted following a majority inquisitorial conclave vote on site, encompassing a host of measures like the sterilization and relocation of Armageddon survivors to Adeptus Arbite's camps across the stars, despite the populace being largely uncorrupted and ignorant of the war's esoteric aspects. The brave souls of the Armageddon Steel Legion and Planetary Defense Forces faced a dire prospect of severe censure or extermination for their unwitting exposure to chaos. While exterminatus of Armageddon was out of the question, given the planet's vital industrial contributions to the Imperium and Segmentum Solar's defenses, the Inquisition's harsh protocol stood firm against all appeals to mercy or reason. Command of the Armageddon containment operation was held by Lord Kisnaros aboard the commandeered Imperial Navy battlecruiser, Coral's Hope, marking him as the highest-ranking Inquisitor on the mission. His approach to the Armageddon sterilization efforts echoed the Inquisition's utilitarian and unflinching stance. It was deemed preferable to sacrifice millions on the suspicion of chaotic corruption than risk the potential necessity of exterminating billions to curb the spread of such taint. As the conflict drew to a close, despite Logan Grimnar's vocal protests, which were transmitted to all Imperial forces, Kaisnaros initiated the first phase of containment. Under his orders, inquisitorial stormtroopers started to evacuate the hive cities, corralling the inhabitants into camps under the guise of administering vaccinations, which were in grim reality sterilizing injections. The populace was misinformed that the evacuation was merely a temporary security measure. The human military forces on Armageddon, including over 1 million Imperial Guardsmen who had arrived to conduct cleanup operations post-Angron's defeat, were directed to barracks for their impending processing. On the ground, the Space Wolves conducted only limited interference, recognizably outgunned by the imposing presence of over 100,000 inquisitorial stormtroopers, among other forces of the Inquisition. Yet the Space Wolves held the upper hand in the orbital arena, with a fleet of 16 starships outmatching the Inquisition's 12, their vessels boasting superior size, armor, and firepower. Grimnar's strategy centered on facilitating the escape of Armageddon's human defenders and civilians from Inquisitional clutches, ensuring that their transports could safely make the leap into the warp at the earliest opportunity. To this end, 20 transports were already in position above the planet, ready to receive their human charges. Amidst escalating tensions, the inaugural transport, named the Trident of Ilmatha, filled predominantly with warriors and some civilians, set course for the Armageddon system's warp jump point under the vigilant escort of the Space Wolves frigate Ruin Fire. Tragically, it was destined never to navigate the warp. Its drive was sabotaged by the Grey Knight's frigate Carabella, which subsequently destroyed the vessel, eliminating all 400,000 souls aboard. This grim event marked both the initial fatalities and the opening salvos of the ensuing conflict. In a show of restraint, the Space Wolves did not immediately engage the attacking ship. Grimnar, in a deliberate act of observation, awaited further actions by the Inquisition, a judgment that would be one among many missteps on both sides. In the wake of this tragedy, Grimnar orchestrated for all laden transports to ascend to orbit simultaneously, each sheathed by a cordon of Space Wolves ships, which had orders to absorb any inquisitorial assault without retaliating. This maneuver aimed to ensure that against the odds, at least some ships would reach the system's warp jump points unscathed. Kisnaros, who had previously engaged in a fruitless and heated debate with Grimnar that deteriorated into mutual invectives and dire threats, responded by commanding his fleet to strike both the Space Wolves' escorts and the transports themselves. Yet, before his orders could fully manifest in action, the Space Wolves' reinforcements, led by the imposing battle barge Gilferheim, emerged in system, tipping the scales towards Space Wolves' naval dominance. A victorious Grimnar demanded that Kisnaros stand down his forces, a command the Lord Inquisitor was compelled to heed given the circumstances. Consequently, the majority of the transports ferrying the survivors of Armageddon prevailed in the short-lived conflict. Under the aegis of the Space Wolves' fleet, they transitioned into the warp, charting a course to safety. With a number of transports bearing witnesses having navigated out of the system, the Inquisition engaged its draconian measures. This not only encompassed the transports and their Space Wolves escorts, but also extended to any entity, outpost or world that had even the slightest interaction with those fleeing from Armageddon. They were all subjected to potential inquisitorial purges. Lord Inquisitor Kisnaros, endowed with exceptional authority that spanned across sectors, led his fleet on a relentless pursuit, dispensing destruction upon anyone unfortunate enough to have encountered the refugees. Several planets suffered under his command, including Tybalt, which met its end through a viral bombardment from the re-equipped battlecruiser Coral's Hope, simply because an Armageddon evacuee transport made a transitory supply stop at its orbital stations. The purging armada included vessels from the Grey Knights, with the battle barge Fire of Dawn, under the command of Grandmaster Euros from the 8th Brotherhood of Grey Knights, performing its grim duty in the campaign. Grandmaster Euros, at the helm of the Grey Knights contingent within Kisnaros' fleet, formed a Brotherhood-level force that swelled in ranks during the containment operations post-Armageddon. Euros, a crucial counselor to Kisnaros in the dealings with the Space Wolves, suggested a strategy hinged on force and the projection of unwavering intent. He knew the Space Wolves revered power and audacity, and advised that any encounter with the Astartes be approached from a position of unmistakable strength, advice Kisnaros adopted without hesitation. Meanwhile, under Grimnar's strategic guidance, the Space Wolves played a cunning evasion game against the inquisitorial forces. Despite facing formidable containment operations, they succeeded in escorting several transports filled with Armageddon survivors to safety, scattering them across distant star systems beyond the reach of the Inquisition's grasp. Amid the ranks of the inquisitorial fleet tasked with the Armageddon containment, dissent was brewing. The scale of the purges and the aggressive stance against the Space Wolves, whose responses were notably restrained, were the seeds of unrest. From the inception of the Armageddon conclave, a faction of Inquisitors had opposed such drastic measures, and their discontent grew as operations persisted. Among the most outspoken was Inquisitor Annika Jarlsdottir of the Ordo Malleus, who hailed from Fenris. The Grey Knights, tasked to serve alongside the Inquisition, also found themselves in turmoil, troubled by the deviation from their core mission. They coined the term months of shame for the campaign, reflecting a shared disapproval. This internal conflict was further stirred by the enigmatic presence of Lord Inquisitor Kisnaros. Even among his peers, Kisnaros was a cipher, his past actions before and during the First War for Armageddon shrouded in secrecy. Adding to the intrigue, Kisnaros operated without clear alignment to any of the established orders of the Inquisition, leaving no discernible trace for them to follow. Unusually, he had neither retinue nor attendants, a departure from the norm for an inquisitor of his rank, preferring instead to rely solely on his own judgment. Compounding the suspicion was his appearance. Extensive rejuvenation treatments rendered him deceptively youthful, belying his true age and experience. Despite the mistrust, his mandate, endowed by unseen superiors, was clear and seemingly unconditional. Half a year into the relentless containment campaign, the toll was mounting and success seemed ever elusive. The strategy had become a protracted affair, with the conclusion nowhere in sight. Grandmaster Yoros, analyzing the stalemate, recommended the bold move of capturing Logan Grimnar, theorizing that such an act could coerce the Space Wolves into submission. Inquisitor Lord Kisnaros, aligning with this tactic, gave the go-ahead for a ploy. Kisnaros extended an invitation for a conference with Grimnar, which was accepted. The chosen location for this diplomatic encounter was the neutral Haikaran system, where both parties would meet unarmed. Skeptical of each other's intentions, Kisnaros, wary of past Space Wolves' deceits, and Grimnar equally distrustful of the Inquisition's duplicity, they approached the parley, but Kisnaros was prepared. He had secretly summoned the containment fleet to the rendezvous in Haikaran. When Grimnar's escort, led by his flagship the Skramasiax, emerged into real space, the Inquisition's assembled forces, betraying the truce, unleashed a surprise attack. The Space Wolves' escorts were obliterated, and the Skramasiax sustained severe damage. Kisnaros then invited Grimnar aboard the Fire of Dawn to negotiate terms, a thinly veiled euphemism for capitulation. Grimnar seemingly acquiesced. Accompanied by his Wolf Guard, he boarded the Fire of Dawn, where he was met by the full assembly of Kisnaros' inquisitors and their retinues, and the entirety of the Grey Knights, led by Lord Joros. Kisnaros attempted to justify his perfidious actions and offered a stark ultimatum: peace through surrender, or a grim future through continued defiance. Grimnar's purpose, however, was not to yield but to seek accountability for the broken truce. When Lord Joros, with a heavy heart, confessed to commanding the attack, Grimnar's retribution was swift and fatal. His frost axe, Morkai, claimed the life of the Grey Knight Grand Master in a singular, lethal stroke. As the shocked Inquisition forces braced for conflict, Kisnaros stayed their hands. He oscillated between conciliation and threat in an effort to sway the Great Wolf. But Grimnar remained unyielding, scornful of Kisnaros' attempts. Understanding the Grey Knight's internal conflicts regarding the campaign, Grimnar had anticipated their next move. As they endeavored to psychically prevent the Space Wolves' escape, Grimnar's retinue disrupted their concentration, killing the Justicars whose mental prowess was crucial to the attempt. In the ensuing chaos, the Space Wolves teleported back to the battered Skramasiax. Kisnaros, outmaneuvered and despondent, could only watch as the Skramasiax, with its defiant crew, disappeared into the vastness of space. Following the ill-fated attempt to seize Grimnar, the confrontation escalated dramatically. The months succeeding the botched parley saw the Space Wolves abandoning restraint, unleashing their firepower against the Inquisition's Armageddon containment forces with relentless fury. They engaged and annihilated numerous vessels of the Inquisition and the Grey Knights, among which was the venerable Glaive of Janus, a flagship of the Grey Knights' first brotherhood for millennia, claimed by the Void along with its valiant crew of over 50 veteran Grey Knights. In dire need of support, the Inquisition called for reinforcements, obtaining the allegiance of the Red Hunters' Space Marine chapter, among others. The Red Hunters rallied to Kisnaros' armada with their full chapter strength and fleet, including their formidable battle barge in Sacred Trust, led by Chapter Master Dimar. Kisnaros sought the Red Hunters, a chapter known for its historical alignment with the Inquisition, to demonstrate that the Space Wolves' stance was not universally shared by the Adeptus Astartes. Moreover, Kisnaros harbored doubts about the Grey Knights, noticing some were covertly distancing themselves from the ongoing campaign and hesitating to fully engage. The clashes intensified, yielding mounting losses on both sides. Yet the campaign's effectiveness continued to wane, the toll of casualties soaring into the billions, signifying the stark failure of the containment endeavor. Too many of the survivors from Armageddon had been scattered by the clever maneuvers of the Space Wolves. Nonetheless, this strategic success for the Space Wolves came at a severe cost, as their actions inadvertently led to countless additional innocents being purged by the Inquisition. Amongst the ranks of the Inquisition, discontent was reaching a critical threshold. A secret plot to eliminate Kisnaros was brewing, fueled by high-ranking dissenters such as Inquisitor Jarl's daughter and esteemed members of the Grey Knights like Hyperion. The conspirators believed that only the death of Kisnaros could cease the fratricidal bloodshed and avert an all-consuming civil war within the Empire. Kisnaros, now frequently consulting with the uncompromising officers of the Red Hunters, had meanwhile taken to monitoring communications with servo skulls aboard every vessel in the fleet. While the conspiratorial machinations intensified, Kisnaros, though not openly conceding, recognized the collapse of his strategy. In early 445, M41, after an arduous 8-month-long campaign, the endeavor to contain Armageddon was relinquished. Kisnaros decreed a radical shift in tactics. He ordered all forces to converge on Fenris, the Space Wolves' sparsely defended homeworld. With this audacious maneuver, Kisnaros aimed to leverage the entire planet as a bargaining chip, coercing Logan Grimnar into submission to the Inquisition's terms. The demands had evolved far beyond the initial concerns with Armageddon, now aiming squarely at curtailing the Space Wolves chapter's long-cherished sovereignty and independence. The formidable fleet commanded by Kisnaros, bristling with the combined might of inquisitorial warships, the formidable Grey Knights fleet, and the entirety of the Red Hunters' chapter armada converged on Fenris. They took up a high orbit around the planet, with their weapons trained on the Fang, the Space Wolves' storied fortress monastery, preparing for a potential devastating orbital strike. Fenris lay surprisingly vulnerable, as the majority of the Space Wolves and their battle fleet were scattered on engagements throughout the cosmos. From the command deck of his flagship, Kisnaros issued a call for a parley, extending the invitation to any Space Wolves of ranking status, which the few present accepted. To negotiate, Kisnaros summoned Grey Knight Hyperion, honored by the Space Wolves as the Bladebreaker, after his pivotal role against Demon Primarch Angron on Armageddon, and Inquisitor Jarl's daughter, a representative from the Inquisitorial Ordos. Despite being aware of Hyperion's previous involvement in a plot against his life and Jarl's daughter's open distrust, Kisnaros desired a strong delegation to parley with the Space Wolves. Upon arrival at the Fang, the delegation was met by the venerable dreadnought Bjorn the Fell-Handed. Bjorn, a revered figure who had fought alongside Primarch Lemon Russ and served as the first Great Wolf, commanded immediate respect from the delegation and was considered a wiser negotiator than Logan Grimnar could have been. Kisnaros laid out his demands: unequivocal submission to the Imperium's hierarchy and a penitent crusade by the Space Wolves as atonement for their insubordination. In return, the Inquisition would withhold further reprimand against the chapter. Bjorn, unimpressed, rebuked the demands, criticizing the indignity of subjecting a venerable chapter to the whims of the Inquisition, especially under the threat of orbital bombardment. He called upon Kisnaros to present a stronger argument, but before the discussion could proceed further, the Space Wolves fleet, led by Logan Grimnar, made a sudden and dramatic appearance from warp space, having made the journey at a staggering pace, albeit at great cost. The discussions were cut short, as the delegation swiftly withdrew to Coral's Hope. A tense and terse communication between a rattled Kaisnaros and a defiant Grimnar escalated quickly into a full-blown naval conflict over Fenris. Kaisnaros, assisted by senior officers from Battlefleet Solar, seized direct control of the Inquisitorial Armada. His earlier panic was replaced by a composed mastery of naval strategy as he directed a bombardment of the Fang while managing his fleet's tactical positions against the incoming Space Wolves boarding torpedoes, with a command to the Red Hunters to initiate counterboarding actions. In the midst of the naval melee, the Space Wolves' Skramasiaks pulled alongside Coral's Hope, its formidable defenses tipping the scales as Coral's Hope's shields succumbed. Grimnar and his Wolf Guard teleported directly onto the Inquisitorial battlecruiser's bridge. Chaos erupted on the bridge, but Grimnar made a beeline for Kaisnaros. In spite of the defense mounted by Hyperion and another Grey Knight, and the efforts of Inquisitor Jarlsdottir, Grimnar was relentless. Kaisnaros, a capable psyker, appeared either unwilling or unable to defend himself, and with Grimnar's swift action, the Inquisitor Lord was abruptly slain. The demise of Kaisnaros did little to dampen the fury of the Space Wolves, who seemed intent on a total bloodletting, until Bjorn the Fell-Handed himself teleported onto Coral's Hope's bridge, his voice alone halting the carnage. His authoritative presence and call for reason paved the way for a ceasefire, initiating a tense but necessary truce among the battered warriors. Bjorn the Fell-Handed, with the gravity befitting his ancient status, decreed an end to the hostilities, urging Grimnar to seek a middle ground with the Inquisition and the powers of the Imperium. He turned to Jarlsdottir and Hyperion, the highest Inquisition officials present, decreeing a bold edict. No Inquisition craft would ever cast a shadow over Fenris skies again. Furthermore, instead of erasing the memories of the Space Wolves privy to the Grey Knight's involvement, a common Inquisition practice, Hyperion was to educate the Astartes within the Fang about the Grey Knight's sacred duty, ensuring such bloody misunderstandings would never reoccur. Both parties, though with reluctance, concurred, and thus the siege was lifted. Yet the accord was born from necessity, not desire. The Space Wolves bore grievous wounds, their fleet was in ruins, their serfs and thralls had been significantly reduced, and Astartes lay dead or crippled in unprecedented numbers. The Fang itself bore scars worse than those inflicted by Magnus the Red in the 32nd millennium, with Imperial vessels embedded in its structure, and the devastation from the bombardment beyond what had been seen before. The Inquisition's forces, particularly the Grey Knights, were similarly marred by the fray. The chapter had lost several ships and a whole brotherhood's worth of its precious Astartes, a blow still raw on the heels of the grueling First War for Armageddon. Yet perhaps more corrosive than the physical toll was the breach of faith between the Space Wolves and the Imperium's enforcers. Doubt crept through the Grey Knights' ranks, with some questioning their leaders and others wary of Kaisnaros' crusade. Nonetheless, Kaisnaros acted not as a lone wolf, but as a hound of the Inquisition's upper circle. His command over Inquisitors and a full chapter's fleet, his long campaign against the honored Space Wolves, and the Grey Knights deployed well outside their typical remit of battling demons, all pointed to directives from the highest Inquisition authorities. This was evident as the Inquisitors convened over Fenris, begrudgingly acknowledging the truce, yet already scheming to subjugate the Space Wolves by any means, including tampering with the very essence of their gene seed. The Space Wolves, too, were under no delusions of a lasting peace. With the last of the Inquisition's ships vanishing into the void, Grimnar and the surviving wolves were already steeling themselves for the inevitable resurgence of strife with the Imperium's shadowy custodians. Thus you have been acquainted with the grim narrative called the Months of Shame. Take heed of this chronicle, as I would not care to recount it anew. I appreciate your engagement. Do return or leave a comment regarding which segment of history you'd like to extract from my repository of knowledge next. This ends today's transmission.